In a house where silence became a religion and every step was measured, a little girl's joy was the one prayer no one dared speak until the afternoon a stranger dared to cook. For 3 years, the Battin mansion had existed in a state of controlled mourning. Fred Battin, 41, billionaire tech investor in tailored blue suits and perfectly knotted grief, believed precision could heal what the crash had broken. His daughter Linda, 8 years old and blind since the accident that took her mother, lived behind drawn curtains in a world of texture and whisper. No therapist had reached her. No technology had brought her back. Then came Sally Brown, a temporary cleaner with no credentials, no reputation, just warmth in her voice and courage in her hands. One afternoon in the kitchen, she asked a question no one else had dared. "You like to cook, sweetheart?" Linda's small voice answered, "I can't see the food." Sally smiled. "Good thing cooking's about feeling and smell. Seeing just makes people miss the magic." It was the first real smile Linda had given anyone in years. But what if that smile was only the beginning? What if the real transformation would cost more than anyone expected? Stay with us to discover how one woman's simple act of defiance could shatter the walls grief had built. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us, can love really bring light back into darkness? Sally had been working in the Battin mansion for just over 2 weeks, long enough to learn the architecture of silence that governed every room. Linda rarely emerged from her carefully designed spaces, moving only along memorized paths with her hands trailing walls, her world reduced to what could be touched and never seen. Fred himself was more ghost than father, drifting between conference calls and his study, speaking only in clipped instructions, his eyes always somewhere else, somewhere in the past. That afternoon had been no different, and Sally had felt a familiar frustration building as she prepared ingredients in the gleaming white kitchen. She had grown up in a household where food was love made visible, where the kitchen was the heart that pumped life through every room, where laughter rose like steam from boiling pots. The Battin kitchen, by contrast, felt sterile, like an operating room where nothing living was allowed to grow. On impulse, as she stood chopping garlic and watching Linda sit motionless at the small breakfast table, fingers tracing the same grain of wood she traced every day, Sally made a decision. She set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and crossed the space between them. "Linda, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and unhurried, "would you like to help me make something special?" Linda's head tilted, confusion flickering across her small face. "I can't cook. I can't see." Sally knelt, bringing herself to eye level with the girl. "That's the beautiful secret nobody tells you. The best cooks in the world don't cook with their eyes. They cook with their hands, their noses, their hearts." She reached out gently, taking Linda's small hand in hers. "Can I show you?" For a long moment, Linda didn't move. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Sally guided her to the counter, positioning her safely away from the stove, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from it. "First rule," Sally said, "heat talks to you. You don't need to see it. You feel it calling from here." She held Linda's wrist near the burner, just close enough to sense the warmth. Linda's eyes widened. "It's singing," she whispered. "Exactly," Sally said, her heart swelling. "Now let's teach you the music." She placed a wooden spoon in Linda's hand and guided it toward a pot of simmering soup. "Stir slowly," Sally instructed, her hand over Linda's, moving in gentle circles. "Feel how the spoon pushes through? That's the soup telling you it's almost ready." Linda's concentration was absolute, her tongue peeking out slightly as she focused. Then Sally reached for a sprig of basil, crushed it between her fingers, and held it beneath Linda's nose. "What do you smell?" Linda inhaled deeply and her face transformed. "Summer," she breathed. "It smells like before." Sally felt tears prick her eyes but kept her voice steady. "That's basil, baby. And you just proved you've got a chef's nose." She reached for rosemary next, then thyme, then a lemon she sliced open, misting Linda's cheeks with citrus. At the lemon spray, Linda gasped, then giggled. It was a small sound, fragile as glass, but it rang through the kitchen like a bell no one had heard in years. "There it is," Sally whispered, her own smile breaking wide. "There's that beautiful laugh." Encouraged, Linda stirred faster, leaning into the pot as if she could pull the warmth into herself. Sally added ingredients, narrating each one. The splash of cream, silk in a bottle, the crack of pepper, little lightning, the pinch of salt, the kiss that wakes everything up. Linda repeated the words like poetry, committing each sensation to memory. Her confidence grew with every stir, every sniff, every texture Sally placed in her palm. She crushed oregano between her fingers, rolled a tomato across the counter to feel its weight, dipped a fingertip in honey, and tasted sunshine. "I'm cooking," Linda whispered, wonder threading through her voice. "I'm really cooking." "You absolutely are," Sally confirmed, emotion thick in her throat. "And you're doing it beautifully." Then Sally did something bold. She pulled a second apron, smaller, bright yellow with printed sunflowers, from her bag. "Every real chef needs a uniform," she announced, draping it over Linda's head and tying it at her back. On impulse, she grabbed a pair of oversized sunglasses from the counter, left over from some forgotten summer, and gently placed them on Linda's face. "Now you look like a celebrity chef," Sally laughed. Linda reached up, touching the frames, and her smile grew into something radiant and unguarded. She struck a small pose, spoon held aloft like a scepter, and Sally clapped her hands in delight. "Work it, Chef Linda." The girls' laughter bubbled up again, louder this time, filling the kitchen with sound it hadn't held since Grace was alive. Linda stirred with both hands now, her whole body swaying to a rhythm only she could hear, and Sally matched her movement, humming softly, letting the moment build into something neither of them could name, but both could feel. Neither of them heard the front door open. Neither noticed the footsteps in the hall or the soft click of a briefcase being set down. They were lost in the alchemy of butter and laughter, in the resurrection of Boy from the ruins of grief. And then a voice, low and sharp with shock, cut through the air like a blade. "What is going on here?" Both heads turned. There, framed in the doorway, with his mouth slightly open and his hand frozen mid-reach for his loosened tie, stood Fred Battin, eyes locked on his daughter in oversized sunglasses and a flour-dusted apron. Stirring soup and smiling like the sun had finally broken through 3 years of endless night. Fred Battin had left the quarterly investor briefing 43 minutes early, a first in his professional life. The presentation had been flawless, the numbers exceptional, but halfway through the third slide he'd realized he couldn't remember why any of it mattered. He'd gathered his notes, murmured something about an urgent matter, and walked out into the afternoon light feeling like a man surfacing from deep water. The drive home had been automatic, his hands steering while his mind circled the same tired thoughts. Linda's upcoming specialist appointment, the new adaptive technology vendor he'd scheduled to visit next week, the behavioral therapist's latest progress report that contained no actual progress. He'd been running calculations, days, dollars, probabilities, all the way up the curved driveway. Then he opened the front door and the numbers dissolved. Garlic, rich, unmistakable, warm. The scent hit him like a physical force, followed immediately by the sweet undertone of butter browning in a pan. Fred stopped in the marble foyer, briefcase dangling from suddenly loose fingers, his entire body gone still. For 3 years, this house had smelled like lemon cleaning solution and the faint, sterile ghost of air purification systems. This smelled like living, and then he heard it. Laughter, high, bright, unguarded, a child's laughter that he recognized and didn't recognize all at once because he'd forgotten what his daughter sounded like when she was happy. His feet moved without permission, carrying him down the hallway toward the kitchen. Each step brought the sounds into sharper focus. The rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against metal, a woman's voice murmuring gentle instructions, and again, impossibly, unbearably, Linda giggling. Fred stopped in the kitchen doorway and the world tilted. There, in the center of his pristine white kitchen, with its marble counters and professional-grade appliances that no one ever used, stood Sally Brown with her hand resting lightly on Linda's shoulder. His daughter, wearing oversized pink sunglasses he didn't recognize and a bright yellow apron decorated with sunflowers, was stirring something in a pot on the stove. Actively stirring. On the stove. Her small face was turned upward toward Sally's voice, and she was smiling so wide her dimples showed. Fred's mouth fell open. His briefcase hit the floor with a muffled thud he didn't register. "What is going on here?" The words came out sharper than he'd intended, slicing through the warm bubble of sound. Both heads turned. Sally's expression remained calm, almost serene, while Linda's smile faltered just slightly at the edges. Sally's hand stayed steady on the girl's shoulder, protective but not possessive. "Cooking lesson, Mr. Battin," Sally said evenly, her voice carrying neither apology nor defiance. "For both of us." Fred's eyes darted between them, his pulse hammering in his ears. Linda, at the stove, near open flame. Heat, risk. 1,000 liability scenarios flooded his mind. Burns, accidents, lawsuits, emergency rooms. His daughter couldn't see. What was this woman thinking? But Linda was still smiling, still holding that spoon like it was a treasure, still standing there in ridiculous sunglasses, looking more alive than she had since. "Papa, I'm making soup," Linda said, her voice breathless with pride. "Sally says I have a chef's nose. I can smell the basil and the rosemary," and she inhaled deeply, theatrically. "And garlic. Lots of garlic." Fred opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Sally gently guided Linda's hand in another slow circle through the pot. "We're learning heat by distance," Sally explained, her tone conversational, as if teaching a blind child to cook over open flame was the most natural thing in the world. She held Linda's free hand, wrist up, a careful 6 inches from the burner. "Feel that warmth? That's how you know the stove is on without having to see it. Heat talks to you if you listen." Linda nodded seriously, her concentration absolute. "It sings," she added, as if this made perfect sense. Sally smiled. "Exactly right, sweetheart." She reached for a cluster of herbs on the counter, crushed a few leaves between her fingers, and held them beneath Linda's nose. "What's this one?" "Thyme," Linda announced triumphantly. "It smells like Grandma's garden." Before. Something cracked open in Fred's chest. Before. They never talked about before. The therapist had advised against dwelling on memories that might cause distress. He'd packed away photo albums, turned Grace's portrait to face the wall, edited the past out of the present to make the present more bearable. But here was his daughter, summoning memories through scent, and she was smiling. Sally crushed another herb. "And this?" "Oregano," Linda said confidently. She was leaning into the experience now, her whole body engaged, her fingers flexing as if she wanted to touch everything at once. Fred watched, paralyzed between fear and something he couldn't name. Every protective instinct screamed at him to intervene, to restore order and safety in the carefully controlled environment he'd spent 3 years constructing. But another part of him, a part he'd buried with Grace, whispered that this chaos, this warmth, this risk was exactly what Linda needed. Sally held Linda's wrist near the pot's rim. "Feel that steam, baby? That's the soup telling you it's happy." "Just about ready." Linda tilted her head, concentrating. "I feel it. It's soft, like tiny clouds kissing my hand." Fred's throat tightened. When had his daughter become a poet? A bubble rose to the surface of the pot and burst with a soft pop. Linda startled, then dissolved into giggles, her whole body shaking with delight at the tiny sound. Fred flinched as if the bubble had struck him, as if his daughter's joy was something fragile he might shatter just by witnessing it. His hand gripped the doorframe, knuckles white, his entire world compressing into this single moment where everything he'd believed about control and safety and the proper way to protect the people you loved was being challenged by a woman in an apron and a little girl who just learned that soup could make music. Fred waited until after Linda had been settled in her room for the night, the bedtime routine executed with the usual precision. Story read by her audio assistant, curtains drawn, nightlight positioned at the regulation distance. He'd stood outside her door longer than necessary, listening to her actually hum, a melody he didn't recognize before drifting off to sleep. Now he sat behind his desk in the study, the room lit only by the banker's lamp, casting green shadows across mahogany. His hands were steepled beneath his chin, his tie loosened but not removed, his jaw tight enough to ache. When the knock came, soft, respectful, precisely 3 taps, he didn't look up. Come in. Sally entered with the same calm she'd shown in the kitchen, her apron removed, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't fidget, didn't avert her eyes. She simply waited, standing in the center of the Persian rug, as if she'd been summoned for a performance review rather than a reckoning. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the antique clock's relentless ticking. Fred let it grow, a negotiation tactic he'd perfected in boardrooms. Let the other party speak first, reveal their position, show weakness. Sally didn't speak. Finally, Fred leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. You're here to clean, Ms. Brown, not to experiment with my child. The words landed precisely where he'd aimed them, a clean boundary between her station and Linda's vulnerability. He expected apology, maybe defensiveness. What he got was something that looked uncomfortably like compassion. With respect, Mr. Battin, Sally said, her voice steady and warm. Your daughter doesn't need another person tiptoeing around her like she's made of glass. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. She needs someone who'll let her touch the world again. Fred's jaw tightened. She's blind. She was standing at a lit stove. Do you have any comprehension of the liability? She was 3 feet from the burner, with my hand on her shoulder the entire time, Sally interrupted gently. Heat regulated to medium-low. No oil spatter. Pot handles turned inward. Every safety protocol I learned raising my nephew after his accident. Fred blinked. The information didn't fit the narrative he'd been constructing. That she was reckless, unqualified, dangerously sentimental. Your nephew. Lost his hearing at 6, meningitis. Sally's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Old grief, carefully tended. Spent 2 years watching people treat him like he'd broken entirely when only one piece of him had changed. Then my mama sat him down at her stove and taught him that he didn't need to hear water boil to know when pasta was ready. The clock ticked. Fred realized his hands had unclenched slightly. I'm not trying to fix your daughter, Mr. Battin, Sally continued, her tone respectful but immovable. I'm just trying to remind her she's still in the world, not locked outside of it. Fred stood abruptly, needing the height advantage, the power differential. He moved to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn illuminated by security lights. Everything visible, everything controlled. You don't understand what's at stake. If she gets hurt, if there's even a minor accident, the therapists, the insurance, the scrutiny. He pressed his palm against the glass. I've spent 3 years building an environment where she's safe. Safe, Sally echoed quietly. Or separate? The question hit like a blade between ribs. Fred spun back toward her, anger flashing hot and defensive. How dare you? I'm not judging you, sir. Sally's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath now, the steel of someone who'd been underestimated before and learned to stand anyway. I'm a woman who cleans houses for a living. I know my place. But that little girl upstairs, she's been living in a museum of her own life, and she doesn't need more silence. She needs laughter. She needs mess. She needs to know that being blind doesn't mean being broken. Fred's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed to fire her immediately, to restore order, to remove this woman who dared to see through his carefully constructed walls. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. Something that felt disturbingly like relief that someone had finally said it out loud. What if she gets burned? His voice came out rougher than intended. What if something happens and He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. What if I lose her too? Sally's expression softened, but she didn't move closer. Then we put boundaries in place. Real ones, not walls. I'll never have her closer than arm's length to heat. I'll narrate every step. I'll teach her the same way my mama taught me, by making the dangerous things understandable, not invisible. She paused. But Mr. Battin, keeping her afraid doesn't keep her safe. It just keeps her small. The words settled in the space between them, like stones dropped into still water. Fred turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly against the darkness outside. He thought of Linda's laughter, the way her face had glowed when she'd named the herbs, how she'd stood taller at that stove than she ever did in her carefully supervised therapy sessions. Written safety protocols, he said finally, his voice tight. Every lesson documented. I review them in advance. Any deviation, and this stops immediately. Yes, sir. And she wears protective gear, oven mitts, an apron with longer coverage. Of course, and if she expresses discomfort or fear at any point, then we stop, Sally finished, immediately. Fred nodded once, sharp and final. That's all, Ms. Brown. Sally moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. Mr. Battin, she asked me tonight what her mother's favorite dish was. Said she wanted to try making it. She looked back at him, her eyes kind but unflinching. I told her I didn't know, but that maybe you could tell her. Then she was gone, the door clicking shut with a soft finality that echoed louder than any slam. Fred stood alone in his study, the walls suddenly feeling closer than they had in years. His eyes drifted to his desk, to the locked drawer where he kept the things too painful to look at but too precious to discard. His hand moved almost of its own accord, pulling the key from his pocket, sliding it into the lock. The drawer opened with a whisper. Beneath old contracts and forgotten correspondence lay a sealed envelope, Grace's handwriting elegant and familiar across the front. For Fred, when you're ready to see again. He lifted it with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of paper and ink and all the words he'd been too afraid to read. The seal remained intact. It had been 3 years. He'd opened it once, read the first line, then closed it again, unable to bear whatever wisdom Grace had left behind. Now in the green glow of lamplight, he could just make out that first line through the thin paper. If she ever loses her sight, don't hide her from the light. Fred's throat constricted. His thumb traced the edge of the envelope, then, carefully, almost reverently, he placed it back in the drawer and locked it again. Not yet, but soon. Maybe soon. Linda heard Sally's footsteps first, the soft pad of sneakers on marble, then the lighter tap on hardwood as they moved toward the back of the house. She'd been sitting in her usual chair in the den, fingers tracing the stitching on a throw pillow she'd memorized months ago, when Sally's voice came warm and close. I've got something special to show you today, sweetheart. You game? Linda tilted her head, listening for clues in Sally's tone. What kind of special? The kind you've got to feel and smell to believe, Sally said. A hand extended toward her. Linda could sense the warmth of it before their fingers touched. Come with me? The sunroom had been closed for as long as Linda could remember. She knew it only as the place past the kitchen where Papa keeps the curtains drawn. But when Sally guided her through the French doors, the change in temperature hit her immediately. Warmer, almost liquid, with air that moved differently against her skin. There's more sun in this room than anywhere else in the house, Sally explained, positioning Linda in front of what felt like a table. Thought we'd bring some of that light inside you. Linda's fingertips found the table's edge, smooth, cool glass. What are we doing? Playing a game I used to play with my nephew, Sally said. It's called the smell game. You ready? Before Linda could answer, something was pressed gently into her hands. Small leaves, soft and slightly fuzzy. Sally guided Linda's fingers to crush them, and instantly the air bloomed with green, bright scent that made Linda inhale sharply. What is it? Linda whispered, bringing her hands closer to her face. You tell me, Sally said. What does it smell like? Linda breathed deeply, searching for words. It smells like when Mama used to open all the windows. Like the air after rain, like... Her face lit up. Summer. It smells like summer. Sally's laugh was pure delight. That's basil, baby. And you just described it better than any cookbook ever could. Confidence sparked in Linda's chest, small but growing. She reached forward, her fingers searching. What else is there? Hold on now, explorer, Sally said, and Linda could hear the smile in her voice. We've got a whole world here. Let's take our time. Sally placed something different in Linda's palm, hard, cylindrical, rough bark against her skin. Crush this between your fingers and smell. Linda obeyed and warmth flooded her senses. Sweet, spicy, ancient. Cinnamon, she announced triumphantly. That's easy. Mama used to put it in hot chocolate. Good, Sally said. Now this one's trickier. The next plant had needle-like leaves that pricked Linda's fingers gently. She rolled them, crushed them, brought them to her nose. The scent was sharper, almost medicinal, but underneath it, memory. Grandma's garden, Linda said slowly. When we visited before the accident, she had plants by her back door that smelled like this. Rosemary, Sally confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. You've got a gift, Linda. A real gift. Linda felt herself growing taller, sitting straighter. For once, being unable to see wasn't a limitation. It was making her better at something. More, Linda demanded, her hands already reaching. Sally laughed and obliged. Mint came next, cold alive. Then oregano, earthy pizza smell. Then lavender, soft, sleepy, Mama's dresser drawer. With each identification, Linda's voice grew more confident, her movements more assured. Now we're switching gears, Sally announced. Close your eyes. Well, you know what I mean, she added with a gentle laugh. Give me your hands. Sally placed 2 pieces of fabric in Linda's palms. Linda rubbed them between her fingers, exploring. One was smooth, cool, almost liquid feeling. The other was rougher, more textured, warm. This one, Linda said, holding up her right hand, feels like water but isn't water. It's slippery? Silk, Sally said. Good. And the other? Like, like towels, but thinner. It breathes more. Linen, Sally confirmed. You're on fire today, girl. They moved through textures next. Pebbles smooth from river water, beans that clicked against each other like little drums, velvet that Linda described as what clouds would feel like if clouds were real, burlap that made her giggle because it tickled. Count these, Sally said, pouring pebbles into Linda's cupped hands. Linda's fingers moved with precision, separating each stone, counting aloud. Then beans, then buttons. Her tactile awareness sharpening with each exercise, her world expanding through her fingertips. You know what you're doing? Sally asked softly. You're reading the world, baby, just in a different language than most folks use. Linda beamed. Can we do more? One more thing, Sally said. This one's my favorite. Linda heard a soft cutting sound, then the sharp, clean scent of citrus filled the air. Something cool and smooth was pressed into her hands. Round, dimpled skin, heavier than it looked. Lemon, Linda said immediately. I can smell it already. Can you? Sally said, and Linda heard mischief in her voice. Let's see about that. Suddenly, gentle pressure, a soft squeeze, and then cool mist exploded across Linda's cheeks, her nose, her lips. The citrus scent intensified 100-fold, sharp and alive and impossibly fresh. Linda squealed, a sound of pure, unguarded joy, and clapped her hands over her face, laughing so hard she doubled over. It got me, she gasped between giggles. The lemon attacked me. Sally's laughter joined hers, warm and free. That's lemon mist, sweetheart. That's what summer tastes like when it's flying through the air. Linda was still laughing, still wiping her face, still glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed to radiate from her whole body when Sally squeezed the lemon again, gently, playfully, and another fine mist caught the sunlight streaming through the windows. Linda shrieked again, reaching for the lemon, trying to catch it. Let me try! Let me try! Neither of them saw the shadow in the doorway. Fred stood perfectly still, one hand braced against the doorframe, his expensive suit jacket forgotten somewhere behind him, his tie loosened, his whole body frozen in the act of witnessing. He'd come looking for Sally to discuss the safety protocols they'd agreed upon. Instead, he'd found this, his daughter, surrounded by herbs and textures and light, laughing like she hadn't laughed since Grace was alive. Her hands moved confidently across the table. No hesitation, no fear. She was exploring. She was thriving. And Sally, this woman he'd hired to clean bathrooms, was orchestrating it all with the precision of a maestro and the warmth of a grandmother, building his daughter's confidence one scent, one texture, one moment of joy at a time. Fred's throat constricted. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't treatment. This was life. Messy, spontaneous, beautiful. And Linda wasn't being cured. She was being celebrated. Her blindness wasn't being fixed. Her strengths were being magnified. The lemon mist caught the sunlight again, tiny droplets suspended in golden beams, and Linda's face turned upward toward the warmth she could feel but not see, her smile wide enough to break his heart and heal it simultaneously. Fred realized his vision had gone blurry. He reached up, surprised to find his cheeks wet. Joy doesn't cure, he thought, the realization settling into his bones, but maybe it heals anyway. His hand tightened on the doorframe. Every instinct told him to step forward, to join them, to ask what that herb was, to feel the linen for himself, to let Sally teach him the language his daughter was learning. But his feet wouldn't move. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet. So he stood there, a ghost in his own home, watching through tears as a stranger taught his daughter how to touch summer, how to count with her fingers, how to live in a body that saw differently but felt everything. Linda squeezed the lemon herself this time. Mist exploded everywhere, catching her hair, her clothes, Sally's apron. Both of them dissolved into laughter that echoed through the sunroom and down the hall and into Fred's chest, where it lodged like light breaking through shuttered windows. He turned away finally, quietly, leaving them to their magic. But he didn't go far, just to the hallway where he leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and let himself hear his daughter's turn it without trying to control it, contain it, or understand it. For now, that was enough. Dr. Helena Winters arrived precisely at 2:00 in a charcoal suit and titanium-framed glasses, her credentials preceding her like a royal announcement. Stanford educated, published in 7 journals, consultant to 3 international foundations for pediatric vision rehabilitation. Fred had paid $18,000 for this evaluation, more for the prestige of her name than any realistic hope for a miracle. The formal therapy room, a space Fred had converted from a guest suite specifically for Linda's medical consultations, felt colder than usual. Clinical white walls, adjustable lighting, specialized equipment arranged with surgical precision. Linda sat in the assessment chair, small and still, her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a child who'd learned to endure. Linda, can you tell me if you perceive any light from this direction? Dr. Winter's voice was professional, detached, the tone of someone conducting research rather than speaking to a person. No, ma'am. And now? No. Fred stood against the back wall, arms crossed, watching his daughter submit to tests they both knew would reveal nothing new. Chart after chart, light test after light test, questions designed to quantify loss, to measure the unmeasurable, to put numbers on absence. Dr. Winters made notations on her tablet, her stylus moving with efficient precision. An hour passed. Linda's shoulders had begun to curve inward, her earlier confidence from the sunroom sessions bleeding away under the clinical assault. Finally, Dr. Winters set down her equipment and turned to Fred, her expression carefully neutral. The look physicians practiced when delivering bad news they delivered 100 times before. Mr. Battin, if we could speak in the hallway. Fred followed her out, leaving Linda sitting alone in the chair. Through the partially open door, he could see his daughter's head tilted slightly, listening to their footsteps retreat. But her Winters consulted her tablet, swiping through data with the dispassion of someone reviewing stock portfolios. The optic nerve damage is extensive and permanent. As we discussed 3 years ago, spontaneous recovery at this stage is, well, it's not within the realm of medical possibility. She looked up at him over her glasses. My assessment remains unchanged. Progress toward vision restoration is unlikely. The focus should be on adaptive strategies, continuing with the assistive technology, orientation and mobility training, perhaps a residential program when she's older. The words landed like stones. Fred had known, of course he'd known, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone of Dr. Winter's stature made it feel like a sentencing. What about quality of life? Fred heard himself ask. Emotional development, social integration. Those are important considerations, Dr. Winters said, already gathering her briefcase. But you must adapt your expectations, Mr. Battin. Linda will never have typical childhood experiences. The sooner you accept that reality, the better equipped you'll be to provide appropriate support. She handed him a folder thick with assessment reports. I've included referrals to 3 excellent facilities that specialize in long-term adaptive care. The words long-term care hung in the air like a threat. Fred opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Winters was already checking her watch. I have another appointment at 4, please have my office send the payment confirmation." She extended her hand for a brief professional shake. "I wish I had better news." Then she was gone, her heels clicking down the marble hallway with the finality of a closing door. Fred stood frozen in the corridor, the folder heavy in his hands, feeling something close to humiliation burning through his chest. $18,000 for someone to confirm that hope was foolish, that the joy he'd witnessed in the sunroom was, what, meaningless, temporary, false? He turned back toward the therapy room and his heart stopped. Linda stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands gripping the frame. She'd heard. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Her expression was carefully blank. The mask she wore when she was trying not to cry. "Papa?" Her voice was small, fragile. "Can we go to my room now?" "Sweetheart," Fred started, but she'd already turned, one hand trailing the wall. Her steps mechanical as she navigated the familiar path to her bedroom. Fred followed helplessly, watching his daughter retreat into herself with every step. When they reached her door, she paused. "I'm tired," she whispered. "I'd like to be alone." "Linda, the doctor doesn't understand." "It's okay, Papa." Linda's voice was too controlled, too adult. "I know I can't see. I know I won't get better. It's okay." The door closed softly between them. Fred heard the lock click, a sound she'd never used before. He stood in the hallway, rage and grief warring in his chest, needing somewhere to direct the unbearable feeling of helplessness. His feet carried him downstairs, following the sound of running water in the kitchen. Sally stood at the sink, washing the lunch dishes, humming softly the same melody Linda had been humming for days. The sight of her, calm and content in his kitchen while his daughter locked herself in her room, made something snap. "You," Fred said, his voice rough. "This is your fault." Sally turned, dish towel in hand, her expression shifting from surprise to careful attention. "Mr. Battin, you gave her false hope." The words came out harsh, each syllable sharpened by his own pain. "Teaching her to cook, filling her head with games and laughter, making her think she could be normal. When medical experts are telling me she'll never—" His voice cracked. "You made her believe things could change." Sally set down the towel carefully, her movements deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was steady but not cold, firm but not defensive. "No, sir, I gave her hope that isn't for sale." Fred blinked, the statement hitting him sideways. "What?" "Your doctors can't sell hope, so they say it doesn't exist," Sally continued, meeting his eyes with quiet dignity. "I don't have letters after my name, and I can't measure joy on a chart, but I can teach a little girl that being blind doesn't mean being broken." She paused. "That's not false hope, Mr. Battin. That's just life." She heard the doctor say she'll never recover. Recover from what? Sally's voice rose slightly, passion breaking through her usual calm. "She's not sick. She's different. And the only disease in this house is everyone treating her like she's already gone." The words struck too close, too true. Fred felt his anger collapse inward, leaving only the raw ache beneath. "The doctor said—" "The doctor said she won't see," Sally said gently. "Not that she can't live. There's a difference, sir." Fred had no response. The folder from Dr. Winters hung limp in his hand, suddenly feeling less like a medical assessment and more like a prison sentence he'd paid someone to write. Sally untied her apron slowly, folding it with the same care she brought to everything. Her eyes were bright, with tears or anger, Fred couldn't tell, but her hands remained steady. She set the apron on the counter, smoothed it once, then looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been disappointment. "I'll collect my things," she said quietly. "Sally," Fred started, but he didn't know how to finish the sentence. Didn't know if he was firing her or asking her to stay or apologizing for something he couldn't name. She waited a moment, giving him space to find words he didn't have. When the silence stretched too long, she nodded once, respectful but unbroken, and walked past him toward the service entrance. Fred stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of lunch Linda would never eat, looking at the folded apron with its cheerful yellow sunflowers, and felt the house begin its slow return to the silence he'd worked so hard to maintain. Upstairs, Linda's door clicked shut again. a sound that echoed through marble and wood in the hollow spaces where laughter used to live. The mansion settled back into its tomb quiet, and Fred realized, too late, what he'd just lost. The first morning after Sally left, Fred came downstairs to find basil leaves arranged on the kitchen counter. Three perfect stems laid side by side on a cutting board, positioned exactly where Sally used to prep ingredients. He stopped, briefcase in hand, staring at the small green offering as if it were a message written in code. Linda had done this, somehow in the dark, navigating by memory and touch. His daughter had retrieved herbs from the refrigerator and created her own mise en place, everything in its place, just as Sally had taught her. Fred didn't touch them. He left for work with the basil still sitting there, a silent accusation in the sterile kitchen. The second morning there were tomatoes, two of them, small and round, positioned beside a wooden spoon. The third morning, garlic cloves peeled and waiting, arranged in a careful line. Each day, a new ingredient. Each morning, evidence that his daughter was trying to cook in a kitchen that had gone silent, trying to recreate the magic that had been taken from her. Fred began leaving for work earlier, unable to face the quiet testimony of his daughter's hope. On the fifth night, unable to sleep, Fred wandered downstairs at 2 a.m. and found himself standing in front of Linda's bedroom door. He'd installed a baby monitor years ago, not for safety, but because sometimes he needed to hear her breathing, needed proof she was still there, still alive in the house that had become a mausoleum. He pressed the receiver to his ear out of habit, expecting silence or the soft sounds of sleep. Instead, he heard Linda's voice, so quiet he had to strain to catch the words. "Sally says soup is a hug you can taste," she whispered into the darkness. "Sally says cinnamon is a warmth you can hold in your hand. Sally says—" Her voice broke. "Sally says I'm not broken." Fred's hand found the wall, steadying himself against the weight of his daughter's loneliness. He turned away from her door and walked, not to his bedroom, but to his study, where the locked drawer waited like a confession he'd been avoiding for 3 years. The key was cold in his hand. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the sleeping house. Fred pulled out the envelope he'd touched 100 times but only opened once. Grace's final letter, written 2 weeks before the accident, tucked inside a birthday card she'd never had the chance to give him. He'd read the first line that terrible day in the hospital while Linda was still in surgery, while doctors were telling him his daughter would never see again. Then he'd sealed it back up, unable to bear whatever wisdom Grace had tried to leave him. Now, in the green glow of his desk lamp, Fred broke the seal completely and unfolded the letter with shaking hands. "My love, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, but don't panic. I'm probably fine, and you're just snooping through my desk like you always do when you think I'm not looking." Fred's throat constricted. Even in writing, Grace's humor came through, her lightness that had balanced his darkness. "But just in case, I need you to know some things. About Linda, about us, about the life we're building. If she ever loses her sight, don't hide her from the light." The words were underlined twice, pressed into the paper with such force the pen had nearly torn through. "I know you, Fred. I know how you solve problems, with money and systems and control. But our daughter isn't a problem to be solved. She's a person to be loved. And love doesn't mean wrapping someone in bubble wrap and calling it protection. Remember last Tuesday when I was teaching her to make soup? Yes, at age 5, because life skills don't wait for convenient ages. She couldn't reach the stove, so I lifted her up. She couldn't see into the pot, so I told her to listen instead." Fred closed his eyes, and the memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. Grace in her faded jeans and university sweatshirt, Linda perched on a step stool, both of them bent over a steaming pot. "Listen, baby," Grace had said, her hands covering Linda's ears like headphones. "Hear that bubbling? That's the water telling you it's dancing. When it sings like this, soft and rolling, that's when you know it's ready for pasta." Linda had tilted her head, concentrating with that intense focus she inherited from you. "It sounds happy, Mama." "Exactly," Grace had laughed. "That's how you cook. You listen to what the food is telling you." Fred's vision blurred. He'd been in his study that day, on a conference call, too busy to notice his wife teaching their daughter that joy could be found in paying attention to small things. He forced himself to keep reading. If something happens to me, if you're reading this in grief or shock, or that terrible silent anger you get when the world doesn't obey your expectations, please remember that Linda doesn't need perfection. She needs presence. She doesn't need protection. She needs permission to try, to fail, to grow, to find her own way of seeing. Don't build her a cage and call it safety. Don't silence her laughter because you're afraid she'll get hurt. Let her burn her fingers on the stove once in a while. Not literally, my practical love. I mean, metaphorically. Let her make mistakes. Let her be messy and loud and fully, completely alive. Because that's what love is, Fred. Trusting someone enough to let them experience the world, even when the world is dangerous and uncertain, and nothing like what we planned. I love you, I love her. And if I'm not there to remind you, let this letter speak for me. Our daughter deserves to live in color, not in cotton wool. Always, Grace. Fred finished reading and sat motionless, tears streaming down his face unchecked. The letter trembled in his hands as sobs finally broke through 3 years of carefully maintained control. Grief he'd locked away, fear he'd disguised as logic. Love he'd expressed through restriction because he didn't know any other way to keep his daughter safe. Sally had known. Sally, with her humming and her herbs and her refusal to treat Linda like something fragile, had understood what Grace would have wanted, and he'd driven her away. Fred looked at the clock, 3:47 a.m. Too early to call anyone. Too late to keep pretending he could do this alone. He sat at his desk until dawn broke over the garden, reading Grace's letter again and again, letting each word dismantle the fortress he'd built around his fear. When the first light touched the windows, he picked up his phone with trembling hands and dialed the number Sally had left with his assistant. It rang 4 times. He almost hung up, suddenly terrified she wouldn't answer, that he'd lost this chance too. Then, "Hello?" Sally's voice, thick with sleep but immediately alert. "Mr. Battin?" "Sally," his voice cracked on her name. "I need—" He stopped, searching for words that didn't sound like commands or contracts. "Please, come back. Not to clean, not as staff, as—" He looked at Grace's letter spread across his desk. "As someone who knows how to teach my daughter to listen for boiling water." Silence on the other end, long enough that Fred thought she might refuse, that his cruelty had finally cost him the one person who could reach Linda. Then, soft but certain, "I'll be there in an hour." "Thank you," Fred whispered. "Thank you." He hung up and sat holding the phone, holding Grace's letter, holding hope for the first time in 3 years. Fragile and terrifying and absolutely necessary. Upstairs, morning light was beginning to filter through Linda's curtains. And on the kitchen counter, basil and tomatoes and garlic waited for someone to teach her what they could become together. Sally arrived at 8:07 a.m. carrying a canvas tote bag and wearing jeans instead of her usual work clothes. Fred opened the door before she could knock, his hair uncombed, his shirt untucked, a version of himself his business associates would never recognize. "Thank you for coming," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Sally studied him for a moment, the red-rimmed eyes, the vulnerable posture, then nodded once. "Where's Linda?" "Still sleeping. I thought maybe—" Fred stopped, suddenly uncertain. "I don't know what I thought." Sally reached into her tote and pulled out 2 aprons. One was her familiar yellow with sunflowers. The other was navy blue, crisp and new, sized for a man. She held the blue one out to Fred. "We're making breakfast together," she said simply. "All 3 of us." Fred stared at the apron as if she'd handed him something dangerous. "I don't cook." "You do today." Sally's tone left no room for negotiation. "Linda needs to see her father trying, not succeeding, trying. There's a difference." 20 minutes later, Linda emerged from her room following the sound of voices and the smell of coffee. She paused at the kitchen doorway, her head tilting in confusion. "Sally?" Her voice was small, uncertain, as if afraid the sound might be a dream. "Morning, sweetheart," Sally said warmly. "Your papa and I have a question for you. How do you feel about teaching an old billionaire how to crack an egg?" Linda's mouth fell open. "Papa doesn't cook." "That's what I said," Fred replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Apparently I was wrong." Linda's face transformed, hope flickering across it like sunrise. "Really?" "Really," Fred confirmed. but I'm going to need a lot of help. Sally guided Linda to her usual spot, then positioned Fred on Linda's other side. She established the safety perimeter first. Fred closest to the stove, Linda arm's length away, Sally as the mobile safety coordinator. First rule, Sally announced, we narrate everything. Papa, you're going to describe what you're doing so Linda can see it with her ears. Fred picked up an egg with the delicacy of someone handling a grenade. I'm holding an egg? Linda giggled. You sound scared of it, Papa. I am a little, Fred admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals, but this egg is intimidating. Crack it on the edge of the bowl, Sally instructed. Sharp tap, then pull the shell apart. Fred tapped too gently. Nothing happened. He tapped harder. The egg exploded, shell and yolk mixing into a disaster in his palm. Oh no, Fred said, staring at the carnage. Linda burst out laughing, real, unguarded laughter that filled the kitchen. Papa, you killed it! I murdered the egg, Fred agreed, and found himself laughing too, the sound rusty from disuse. Sally handed him a towel and another egg. Again, this time medium pressure. Linda, you feel your papa's wrist. Tell him if he's too tense. Linda reached over, her small fingers finding Fred's wrist. You're really tight, Papa, like you're angry at the egg. I'm not angry, Fred said. I'm just focused. Maybe focus less, Linda suggested sagely. Sally says cooking is about feeling, not thinking. Fred took a breath, relaxed his grip, and tapped. This time the egg cracked cleanly. He pulled the shell apart, and the yolk dropped perfectly into the bowl. I did it, he sounded absurdly proud. You did it, Papa. Linda clapped her hands. Now me, Sally, can I try? Sally positioned Linda's hands carefully, egg cradled in her palm, bowl beneath. Remember, you're going to feel the bowl's edge first, then tap the egg against it. Not hard, just firm. Linda's concentration was absolute. She felt for the rim, positioned the egg, tapped once. The crack was perfect. She pulled the shell apart by touch, and the egg slipped into the bowl to join Fred's. Beautiful, Sally said softly. You're a natural. They moved through the breakfast choreography, Fred narrating each action. I'm turning on the burner now. Hear that click? Linda identifying scents, butter, vanilla, cinnamon. Sally orchestrating safety with the precision of an air traffic controller. Fred attempted toast. He set the dial wrong, got distracted by Linda's story about a dream she'd had, and forgot about the bread until smoke began curling from the toaster. Papa, Linda said, nose wrinkling, something's burning. Fred lunged for the toaster, pressed the wrong button, and sent a pan clattering to the floor in his haste. The burnt toast shot up like a blackened missile. Everyone froze. Then Linda started laughing. Not polite laughter. Wild, doubled over, tears streaming down her face laughter. Papa made angry toast, she gasped between giggles. Fred stood there, holding blackened bread, pan at his feet, feeling like a complete fool. And then he was laughing too, deep belly laughs he hadn't experienced in years. I made very angry toast, he agreed. Sally rescued the pan, turned off the burner, and joined the laughter. The three of them standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of imperfect humanity. When Linda finally caught her breath, she said quietly, It smells like Mom's toast. The laughter stopped. Fred's hands stilled on the burnt bread. What, sweetheart? Mama used to burn the toast sometimes too, Linda said, her voice soft with memory. When she was singing and forgot to watch, it would smell like this, kind of smoky and sweet at the same time. And she'd laugh and say, extra crispy today, baby. Fred's vision blurred. He set down the toast and knelt in front of his daughter, taking her hands in his. She'd be proud of you, he whispered, his voice breaking. So proud of how brave you are, how strong, how you learned to cook and smell, summer, and laugh even when everything is hard. Linda's hands found his face, her fingers tracing the wetness on his cheeks. You're crying, Papa. Happy tears, Fred managed, because I just realized my daughter is teaching me how to live again. Linda threw her arms around his neck. and Fred held her, really held her, for the first time in 3 years, without fear or control or the weight of all the things he couldn't fix. Just love. Sally busied herself at the counter, wiping her own eyes, giving them space. When they finally separated, Linda reached out with both hands, one finding Fred's, the other finding Sally's. "Can we make pancakes now, together?" Sally handed Fred a wooden spoon and took one herself. She poured batter into a bowl and positioned it between them. "Everyone stirs. We'll find the rhythm together." 3 hands found the bowl. 3 people began to stir. Awkward at first, bumping into each other, laughing when Fred went the wrong direction. But gradually they found it. A rhythm that was theirs alone, moving in sync, building something new from simple ingredients and complicated love. In the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows, the Battin family learned what Sally had known all along. Healing doesn't require perfection. It just requires showing up, holding hands, and stirring in the same direction. 6 weeks after Sally's return, Fred found himself setting the garden patio table for 8, the first dinner party the Battin mansion had hosted since Grace's death. His hands moved mechanically through the placement of silverware and crystal, but his mind was in the kitchen where Linda was insisting, with the stubborn determination she'd inherited from both her parents, that she would prepare the main course. "I can do it, Papa," she'd announced that morning. "Sally and I have been practicing." Fred had looked to Sally, searching for permission to refuse, to protect, to control. Sally had simply smiled and said, "She's ready. Question is, are you?" Now, through the open kitchen pass-through window, Fred could see them working, Sally moving with the choreography of a safety conductor. Linda's hands moving confidently through tasks that would have seemed impossible 2 months ago. "Linda," Fred called through the window, forcing himself to stay at his post, even as every protective instinct screamed at him to intervene. "Tell me what you're doing." This was their new system, constant narration, painting pictures with words, so Linda could see through language what her eyes couldn't show her. "I'm crushing rosemary in the mortar and pestle," Linda announced, her voice proud and clear. "Feel the bowl vibrating. That means I'm using enough pressure. Smell coming through now, that woodsy Christmas tree smell. That's how I know it's releasing the oils." Fred watched her work the stone pestle in controlled circles, her face a mask of concentration. Sally stood at her shoulder, one hand hovering near but not touching, ready to guide only if needed. "Beautiful sweetheart," Fred said, his throat tight. "What's next?" "Garlic," Linda said. She reached to her left, finding the pre-peeled cloves by their designated position. 3 cloves already prepped. "I'm adding them to the mortar now. Crushing together, rosemary and garlic become paste, like making paint, but edible." Her language had transformed over the weeks, poetic, sensory, painting the world in scent and texture and sound. Fred realized with a jolt that his daughter was becoming an artist, her medium just different from what he'd imagined. The doorbell rang. Neighbors arriving. "Are you firm?" The Harrisons from down the street. The Chen family whose daughter was Linda's age. Michael Rivera, who ran the community foundation Fred supported. People who'd stopped calling after the accident, unsure what to say to a man who'd lost everything. Fred greeted them with handshakes and guided them to the patio, where warm light spilled from paper lanterns Sally had insisted on hanging. They settled into chairs, making polite conversation, but Fred could feel their curious glances toward the kitchen. "Is Linda joining us?" Margaret Harrison asked carefully, the way people spoke around tragedy. "She's cooking," Fred said simply, watching their eyebrows rise. Through the pass-through, the performance continued. Sally had positioned a standing lamp near Linda's workspace, creating what she called a spotlight station. Not for Linda's benefit, but so Fred's guests could see the miracle unfolding. "Papa," Linda called, "I'm starting the sauce now. Can you walk everyone through it?" Fred moved to the window, his guests following. They watched as Linda poured pre-measured stock into a saucepan. Sally had taught her to use the finger method, placing her index finger inside the pot to feel the liquid level rising. "She's adding vegetable stock," Fred narrated, his voice carrying the wonder he felt. "Using touch to measure depth. Now the herb paste from the mortar. She's scraping it with a spatula, 3 o'clock position, to avoid the heat." Linda stirred with confident strokes, her head tilted toward the pot, listening to the liquid's voice. "It's beginning to simmer," she announced. "Hear the small bubbles? Like tiny fireworks. That means it's almost ready for the next step." The guest stood mesmerized. Emily Chen whispered to her husband, "I didn't know that was possible." "Neither did I," Fred whispered back, honest in his awe. 20 minutes later, Sally helped Linda plate the dishes. Roasted chicken with herb sauce, vegetables arranged by contrast rather than color. Fred carried the plates to the table with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. Linda emerged from the kitchen, guided by Sally, wearing her sunflower apron and the oversized sunglasses that had become her signature. She stood at the head of the table, Grace's old spot, with Sally beside her and Fred on her other side. "I cooked it," Linda said, her voice clear and proud. "With my friends." Fred looked at his daughter standing tall in her mother's place, at Sally, whose patience had rebuilt what grief had broken, and felt his phone buzz in his pocket. The investor call, the one he'd been preparing for all month, the deal that could reshape his portfolio. He pulled out the phone, saw the reminder, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 8 weeks ago. "Excuse me," he said to his guests. He stepped away, dialed his assistant, and spoke quietly. "Reschedule the Nakamura call. I'm staying through dessert. No, through everything. Tell them I'm exactly where I need to be." He returned to find Linda still standing, waiting for his response. Fred moved to her side and put his arm around her shoulders. "You didn't cook it with your friends, sweetheart," he said softly. "You cooked it with your heart, and your mother would be so incredibly proud of you." Linda beamed, her smile radiating something that looked like healing. They ate together, guests praising every bite, Fred narrating compliments so Linda could hear the impact of her work. Conversation flowed like it hadn't in years, laughter punctuating stories, the garden filling with the sound of connection. Margaret Harrison leaned toward Fred as Sally helped Linda bring out dessert. "She's wonderful with Linda. Is Sally family?" Fred watched Sally steady Linda's hands as they carried a tray of fruit tarts Linda had assembled by touch. He thought about titles: employee, housekeeper, helper. None of them fit what Sally had become. "Yes," Fred said without hesitation, the word feeling like the first true thing he'd said in years. "Family." Sally looked up at that moment, met his eyes across the patio, and smiled. A smile of recognition, of belonging, of a truth they'd all stumbled toward through burnt toast and crushed herbs in the slow, messy work of learning to live again. Linda felt for her chair, found it, and sat down between them. She reached out with both hands, one finding Fred's, the other finding Sally's, and held on. "Thank you for coming to our table," Linda said to the guests, her voice carrying the grace her mother had possessed. "There's always room here for people who want to share light." In the warm glow of paper lanterns, surrounded by friends and the evidence of impossible things made real, Fred Battin finally understood what Grace's letter had meant. Love wasn't protection. Love was presence. Love was making space at the table and trusting that there would always be enough. And for the first time in 3 years, the Battin mansion felt less like a monument to loss and more like a home where life was still being written, one meal at a time. 3 months after Sally returned, on an evening when autumn was beginning to whisper through the trees, she found Linda finishing homework in the sunroom and made an unexpected proposal. "I have something to show you outside," Sally said softly. "Something I have been working on with your papa. You game for an adventure?" Linda's face lit up. "Always." Sally guided Linda through the French doors and into the garden, where dusk was settling like silk over the manicured lawn. Linda felt the temperature change immediately. Cooler air, the scent of late roses and turning leaves, the soft give of grass beneath her feet instead of marble. "Where are we going?" Linda asked, one hand holding Sally's arm, the other reaching forward to feel the space ahead. "You'll see," Sally said, then laughed. "Well, you'll feel, which is better." They walked 20 paces, Linda counting steps the way Sally had taught her, building a mental map of distance and direction. Then Sally stopped and placed Linda's on something new. A rope, stretched taut at waist height, leading forward into the garden. "This is your path," Sally explained. "I'm going to let you walk it alone. The rope will guide you. Just follow it and pay attention to everything you feel. I'll be right behind you." Linda's fingers closed around the rope, testing its tension. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the thrill of independence. Okay, she breathed. I'm ready. She began to walk, hands sliding along the rope, feet moving carefully but with growing confidence. The path curved gently left, and Linda adjusted her direction, trusting the guide beneath her palm. Then she felt it, warmth against her right cheek, subtle but unmistakable. She slowed, turning her face toward the source. The warmth intensified, accompanied by a faint golden glow she could perceive even through her damaged vision. There's something here, Linda whispered, reaching out with her free hand. Her fingers found a small lantern, solar-powered and glowing with gentle LED light. The glass was warm to the touch, radiating heat like a miniature sun. Linda gasped. She continued forward, and the pattern repeated. Another lantern, then another, each one positioned along the rope path, each one glowing like a beacon she could feel before she could see. The warmth touched her face, her arms, her hands as she moved through the constellation of light. Sally, Linda breathed, her voice thick with wonder. Is this what light feels like? From behind her, a different voice answered, deeper, breaking with emotion. Yes, baby, that's light. Linda turned, recognizing her father's footsteps approaching. Papa, you helped make this? Fred knelt beside his daughter on the garden path, taking her hands in his. His voice was rough with tears he no longer tried to hide. Sally designed it. I just followed instructions. She's teaching me how to see the world the way you do. Linda's fingers found his face, tracing the wetness on his cheeks. You're crying again, Papa. Good tears, Fred managed, because my daughter just taught me that light isn't just something you see. It's something you feel together. Sally joined them on the path, and Fred looked up at her, this woman who'd walked into his house as a cleaner and rebuilt his family from the inside out. Thank you, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. For everything, for seeing what I couldn't, for being patient when I was impossible, for loving my daughter when I'd forgotten how. Sally's eyes were bright with tears. She made it easy. You both did, once you stopped trying so hard to be perfect. Fred stood, brushing grass from his knees. I've been meaning to talk to you both, officially. He took a breath, steadying himself. Sally, I'd like to offer you a new position. Not as household staff, as household manager and Linda's mobility mentor. Full benefits, proper salary, and he glanced at Linda, then back to Sally. Family status, if you'll have it. Sally's hand flew to her mouth. Fred. I mean it, Fred continued. I've enrolled in tactile cooking classes at the community center. Linda and I are starting orientation and mobility training together next week. We'll learn as a team. But we need you, not as an employee, as, he struggled for the right word, then found it, as family. Yes, Sally whispered, tears streaming freely now. Yes, of course, yes. Linda reached out with both hands, finding Sally with one and Fred with the other, pulling them together. The three of them stood on the lamp-lit path, holding each other as twilight deepened around them and the solar lanterns glowed brighter, marking the way forward. Can we cook dinner together tonight? Linda asked, her voice muffled against Fred's chest. All three of us. I want to make Mama's favorite. Fred looked at Sally over his daughter's head. Sally nodded, smiling through tears. We'll make it together, Fred said, just like everything else from now on. They walked back toward the house, following the rope and lantern path Sally had created, Linda between them with her hands holding theirs. Through the kitchen windows, warm light spilled onto the patio. The house that had been silent for so long was beginning to hum again with life. Inside, they moved through the familiar choreography, Fred narrating his steps, Sally positioning ingredients, Linda's hands confident and sure as she crushed herbs and measured by touch. Laughter rose and fell like music. A pot clanged against the stove. Someone, Fred, burned garlic, and they all dissolved into giggles. From the garden, the path of lanterns continued to glow, marking the route between darkness and warmth, between isolation and connection, between grief and healing. The Battin mansion hadn't grown brighter. They had. And light, it turned out, was something you could feel together, in the warmth of a lantern on your cheek, in the press of flour between your fingers, in the sound of your daughter's laughter echoing through rooms that had forgotten how to sing. In the kitchen, three people stirred soup in the same rhythm, their movements synchronized not by sight but by love, creating something nourishing from simple ingredients and complicated history, proving that the best recipes were written not in cookbooks, but in the language of hands that dared to reach across darkness and hold on. And outside, the lanterns burned on, small lights in the gathering dark, showing that even when you couldn't see the path ahead, you could still feel your way home. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.